Energy Choice Investigation Workshop by the Public Utilities Commission. I'm Joe Reynolds, and I'd like to apologize for the extended break. Some of you have been here, I've been battling illness all week, and urgent care took a little bit longer, and so I very much apologize for taking longer and for the imposition on everyone's time. But these issues that I think we're discussing today are of the utmost importance, and so I want to continue the conversation. With respect to a few housekeeping matters, in the procedural order that I issued on January 10th, I did set a kind of a makeup day for Monday, January 22nd, in case we needed it. I don't intend to be holding workshops on Monday. I don't believe that will be necessary, and that we'll be able to go through the remaining follow-up workshops set forth on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and the following week, and we'll have sufficient time to do that. And so there will be no workshops on this coming Monday, January 22nd. Also, at the request of CAISO, they've asked that we change the days of the follow-up on the retail market issue and the wholesale market issue discussion. Currently, follow-up for the wholesale market is set to occur on Wednesday, January 24th, with the retail market set to occur on Thursday, January 25th. And I'm going to switch the order on those. And the reason is that CAISO does have a previously scheduled board meeting that can't be moved, and I do think that our friends from CAISO's participation is really important in those discussions. And so to allow them to be able to travel back over to Carson City to participate, I'm going to just switch those 2 days so that the retail market discussion will occur on Wednesday, January 24th, and the wholesale market discussion will occur on Thursday, January 25th. And I hope that doesn't inconvenience anyone else. And if it does, please let me know. Where we left off before we took the lunch break, I believe Ms. Terwilliger, you're still up at the microphone, and you were going through your list of some of what you thought were the risks, but also had yet to get to some of the benefits, and wanted to allow you the opportunity to continue that discussion. So please go ahead if you'd like.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Actually, I was to the benefits portion here. Sorry, my papers got a little discombobulated. Give me a second if you don't mind. So I did want to point out, staff had talking about the stranded cost recovery. Staff had noted in its comments towards the end there, starting on page 56, if divestiture were required, the utility would be allowed to sell off its generation or its transmission assets, and those, presuming that those transmission assets had greater value than what the unrecovered costs were, which I think that's a safe assumption, that those could offset any losses that happen in generation. And staff threw that out. We were citing a study of things that had been done in other states. That certainly could be a possibility, but there is nothing in the constitutional amendment that requires them to disgorge their transmission and distribution assets. So there's, that was something we had seen in another state, another study, but I did want to point that out as kind of a something that exists in other states, but our constitutional amendment in no way requires that NVE would have to get rid of its transmission and distribution assets. So I know in the last, when Nevada tried this before, and Anne Marie Ms. Cuneo was here, so she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand from her and Ms. Ettinger that, generation assets, winners and losers of the assets were paired together in packets, And those were meant to be auctioned off in like a group so that, you know, if there was losses that would be had on one asset but gains on another, there was, you know, we were hoping that the net would be something, you know, closer to zero. But, you know, again, this was something we had cited in our comments, and just to give the flip of the coin, this is something that would happen in another state. It was mentioned in the study, which is why we threw it out there. But nothing in the constitutional amendment requires them to get rid of their T&D. Sorry, I'm speaking too fast. Anyway, I'll move on from that. So we did want to point out a few benefits we discovered in our due diligence. The Southwest Power Pool asserts that the market has saved $1 billion for its members and consumers since launching it in 2014. So from a period of 2014 to 2016, they think that about $1 billion has been saved. Now, the only caveat to that I would have is that, you know, the Southwest Power Pool is made up of 9 states, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas. So, you know, I don't know, to the extent that Nevada joins with CAISO, if those benefits in the range of $1 billion over a 2-year period is something that's attainable for us if we joined CAISO. That would certainly, you know, to the extent we get to a study with CAISO, that could be something we could be looking at benefits for members and consumers. Also, the Brattle Group has estimated the net benefits for the Mountain West expansion of the SPP, of the Southwest Power Pool, to be about $88 million per year. But that benefit is tied to joint dispatches. And again, I wanted to caveat that. So for those Mountain West members, the Excel, Black Hills, Colorado Springs Utilities, which is a municipality, Tri-State, and Platte River will be joint dispatching, and that's where that estimate of that savings is from Brattle. Now, as you know, in Nevada, we already, at least within the state, we already joint dispatch. And to the extent we have the EIM, there's an opportunity to, on a real-time basis, to joint dispatch with the CAISO, so to speak, using that term loosely. So, again, I think that's something that if we can get to a study with CAISO, if that's something the legislature or the commission would like, I think that we could really nail down those numbers. But I wanted to discuss some benefits.
Thank you.
That's all on my list.
No, thank you. One of the things we've yet to talk about today with respect to the cost conversation, we hit a little bit on it earlier this week, is again the impact with the NEM program and AB 405. We've heard a lot about from the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ross, about the Texas model. But again, I think as we also pointed out, Texas does have distinctions about regulated metropolitan areas that have some of the net metering programs in Texas. And Texas, my understanding, doesn't have near the net metering that Nevada does. And when we look at, say, for example, a California model, California has at least residential ratepayers are still in a regulated market. So that's not necessarily analogous or comparable to what we're looking at here in Nevada. And discussions and investigations are currently ongoing with respect to net metering here before the commission, and the issues and some of the questions regarding those investigations is what are the true costs of net metering. And those are still being looked at by the commission, they're still being looked at by the legislature, and they're still being understood, evaluated. And the concern that I have with respect to the changes that might come about regarding this petition with respect to the net metering is that, again, if NV Energy leaves as the energy provider here, that no longer is required by the force of law to give a one-for-one excess energy credit to net metering customers for their excess energy, and then we want a competitor to come in. If the market rates are lower than what, for example, is currently required in AB 405, who would want to do that? I don't know that a business could make money doing that. And I think that's an important question to ask, is then how do we continue that program? Because, you know, without even resolving the cost component of net metering, right now at the commission, we're able to make decisions holistically regarding rates. And so it's kind of, we're all in this together, and to the extent there is additional costs to continue the net metering program, those are absorbed in other areas, and to make it work in order to advance our state's public policy goals and renewable energy goals. And when we take that ability of the commission to do that, some hard realities might resurface, and that's my concern. And how do we protect against that? And to the extent nobody in a true competitive market wants to come in and voluntarily service net metering customers and continue our I think, amazing growth in that area, what do? How do we find resources to fill in that gap? Is there anyone who can address that or would like to? Mr. Wellinghoff, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Wellinghoff on behalf of ECI. As you probably will remember, I had a different hat on a while back in the Sierra Pacific Power case, where I was the Chief Policy Officer for Silver City and responsible for actually putting together that case. And I think, as I recall, I think we put on a pretty compelling case that the net costs and the net benefits of rooftop solar are fairly equal. So ultimately, if you're looking at the benefits and costs being equal of rooftop solar, then it's simply a matter of determining, how those benefits can flow to the proper people from the proper places. And if you also recall in that case, in the testimony and exhibits that we provided by Ryan Hanley, who was a former PG&E distribution engineer, and Mr. Heidel, who was a former distribution expert at Puget Energy. They said that there are benefits both on the transmission and generation side, but there are also benefits on the distribution side. So the issue is, how do you ensure that those distribution benefits now can flow up to the consumers, or could flow to retail providers to then go to consumers to ensure that consumers can get those benefits. I think it's a matter of just allocation. It's not a matter of looking at hundreds of millions of dollars of costs that we have to pay for. That's not the case. It's a case of figuring out where the benefits are and how they flow. As for Texas, and I actually know the situation in Texas very well. The reps in Texas, the retail energy providers in Texas, are starting to understand. It took them a little while, but they're starting to understand that the solar customers are actually their most valuable customer. And Solar City recognized that, in fact, was going to go and expand substantially into Texas before Tesla took them over. And that's another whole story that I won't go into. But ultimately, there are a number of reps in Texas at the retail competitive level who in fact do offer solar, in fact do compete in the solar area. So I don't think we're going to have trouble with people coming in and actually wanting solar customers, because ultimately the solar customer de-risks the retail provider in that they know there's a certain set level of generation that they don't have to provide for, that they know and fairly well, and especially in a state like Nevada that has fairly stable weather patterns and good understanding of the solar levels of solar insulation and very high solar insulation here, that ultimately there is a resource that they can depend upon for utilization for that customer, and it's right on the rooftop of that customer. So as such, it is and can be a very valuable resource, and I think really it's not a matter of looking at costs. I mean, it's a matter of looking at ensuring that costs and benefits can be equalized out and properly allocated.
No, and and I hope you appreciate, given your long work on the net metering issue, I think the state is in a good place finally, and we're moving forward with this and making tremendous progress with our rooftop solar capacity that's being applied for and installed, and I think turning that around, because that certainly wasn't, I don't think, the case a few years ago. And I want to make sure that there's not unintended consequences, and even something that we can't foresee of now, to just talk it through, to look at it, to make sure there isn't those consequences. Because my understanding, of Assembly Bill 405, with the excess energy credit, right now, the legislature and the PUC mandate that Nevada Power and Sierra Pacific Power buy back at 95%, and later at 88%, 81%, 75%, the excess energy that's sent back to the grid by solar customers. And in that sense, a solar customer can make money off of that, which helps pay for their system, to pay for the cost of installation, which I think helps grow the rooftop solar industry in the state, which is what we want. NV Energy is always maintained that it's not a competitive rate. It's a statutorily imposed rate, statutorily imposed construct, and you're more familiar, I think, than anyone in this room with the different debates and arguments on that. And the legislature has asked the commission, we have an investigatory docket that's due in June of 2020, looking at that even more closely. My concern is, what if they're right, and nobody shows up to service those NEM customers the way they expect, the way the law provides currently, and the Nevada Power Company says, not our problem anymore. Good luck, Nevada.
Well, again, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the testimony and evidence that we submitted under oath in the Sierra Pacific case, we demonstrated that it will in part be their problem because there are distribution benefits. So to the extent that there are distribution benefits, they will continue, or should continue, if this commission properly structures the system correctly, and that's what you're trying to do, figure out how to de-risk the system and make it work as effectively for everybody. They will continue, or should continue, to pay part of those costs to the net metered customers, and the transmission benefits as well. The generation benefits are, yes, benefits that should be paid by the reps ultimately, because they'll take advantage from the de-risking aspect of that, and their ability to know that that customer will have a certain amount of generation available to them at certain times, etc. But there's got to be, a recognition that these benefits flow across the entire system. And I think we put on very, very good testimony, excellent case, demonstrated that in the Sierra Pacific case.
Thank you for that answer. Is there any recommendation or advice you would have to ensure kind of the concern that I have, other than paying close attention and scrutiny to the distribution benefits? But we're going to be looking at that over the next couple of years, again, to make sure that there's not uncertainty with any of the rooftop solar customers, again, the progress that the state's making. And again, the whole reason I'm asking this is not the intent of the ballot initiative in any way, but just to make sure we don't, as a state, find ourselves in a situation nobody necessarily foresaw.
Well, you've got to be prepared at the point that you're implementing the ballot measures to ultimately set the rate structure such that you can divide these responsibilities between the distribution utility, the T&D utility, in essence, NV Energy, and the responsibilities of the rep to the net meter customer.
And some of my concern with this, again, goes back to the nature that this is a constitutional amendment. Right now, as the Public Utilities Commission, if again things go the way that are not intended, I have tools in resources and reg and statute to step in and fix that. And you know, you always hope that whether it's me or whoever else is sitting in this chair does the right thing and makes good decisions to do that. But if we take away some of that legal toolbox, so to speak, the concern there's less of ability to step in and influence some of those. And that's not a conversation to expand the power of the commission beyond what anyone intends, but it's just a practical who can step in and smooth out the potholes in the road, so to speak.
Well, and as I understand it, the constitutional amendment doesn't take away any of your powers. It just specifically says that, you know, there shall not be generation monopolies, and there shall be an opportunity for competition for all customers. But beyond that, the legislature then can set the structure and your powers to any way to effectuate they want to. So I think you have, and the legislature will have, full flexibility to ultimately implement this structure in a way that will make it work. And you certainly, I think, will retain the power to determine what portion of the fees to net meter customers may be paid by the T&D entity, and what portion may be paid by the competitive retail providers.
And my concern a little bit with that response is a strict constitutional, plain language constructionist might argue differently with respect to some of the phrases about open competition, minimal regulation or minimum regulatory burdens, which I think is a clear intent to restrict regulatory oversight, and also with the direction to look towards reducing rates. And I just want to talk this through because there's other provisions I think that do allow for what you just described within the confines of that amendment as well.
Well, again, it doesn't say to reduce rates; it says to reduce costs ultimately. And again, it's a matter of setting up a construct that provides for competition. So at the end of the day, if you can't set up a structure that provides for that competition, you haven't fulfilled the constitutional mandate. So I would expect that the legislature and ultimately the commission, through the legislative changes that the legislature makes to your powers, will ensure that that's possible at the end of the day.
Into provisions that reduce costs to customers. And then so we get into what's cost.
Let me give you an example that I think Mr. Volz tried to go into earlier today, talking about what portion of the bill is from the generation energy portion versus which portion is from the transmission and distribution, and indicating that if you can only reduce the kilowatt hour rate at the energy portion, by some amount, if that's a small portion of the total bill, you can't reduce the total bill that much. What he is forgetting, and I think what the commission is forgetting, is that's not the only way to reduce costs. You can also reduce costs by ultimately enabling the consumers to be able to participate in wholesale markets. Let me give you an example. In PJM, if you have an electric car and you plug in that electric car and you can provide regulation service into PJM, you can get paid $7 to $10 per day per car to do that. So ultimately, because consumers have all these assets behind the meter, including simply assets to control their air conditioner, they can use those assets to reduce their costs. So there's multiple ways to reduce costs simply by doing things that can participate in the wholesale market that they don't have an opportunity to do now, given that we don't have that structure set up. So we need to look at the overall total picture of how to reduce costs, and not think of it simply of reducing the kilowatt hour rate.
And if any of my questions seem otherwise, I'm just asking questions. Plainly speaking, when I think of costs, I just in my mind think of, as we discussed earlier, as what my monthly bill is. call it a rate, call it a cost, call it an expense, call it a tax, a fee, a charge.
It is your monthly bill, but what I'm suggesting, it's not simply then reducing the kilowatt hour rate, it's enabling the consumer to do many other things that competitive providers will come in and help them do because they want their business. They want those customers to be their customer.
And I think this conversation at least is helpful for me, because from what I'm hearing from you is an interpretation or a view of that reduced cost provision can be much more expansive than simply looking at a bill. That there is cost to the overall infrastructure, to the overall objectives of the state, that we want to reduce costs, whether we look at it to the homeowner, the ratepayer, the taxpayer, to anyone involved. And is that fair? Am I understanding that?
Yes, no, that's fair. But again, also with respect to just the costs on the bill, I'm looking at not simply reducing the billing determinants, or reducing the rate on the bill, but I'm also looking at either reducing the billing determinants, reducing the number of kilowatt hours you use, or using those kilowatt hours in different ways that ultimately can give you money, can give you money revenue coming in to help you reduce that bill. And there's people in California that are doing that. There's people throughout PJM, which is all the way from New Jersey to Chicago, doing that. And in most of the ISOs where we have this opportunity under a number of orders that I put in place while I was at FERC, Order 745 with respect to bidding in energy into wholesale markets by consumers, 755 bidding in regulation service by consumers, fast response regulation service by consumers into wholesale markets. These are all opportunities, in fact, supported by the U.S. Supreme Court, that FERC has jurisdiction over the ability for consumers to ultimately participate in these wholesale markets and lower their costs overall by receiving revenues back. It's another way to lower your costs by instead of using less, you can also get revenues back by the way you use things and the way you do things within your structure, either your home or your business, depending.
Do you have any ideas or suggestions on what could be examples of legislation provisions the legislature could enact to reduce to reduce costs under this petition?
They will be enabled if you have competition come in and allow competitive providers to show consumers how to do it, because competitive providers will come in and do it. They do it in these other states where there is ultimately this type of retail competition. In Texas, for example, they do things like retail providers come in and give free nights and weekends. And the reason they give free nights and weekends, because ultimately it reduces cost for the retail provider, because ultimately they can shift usage of consumers by giving them those benefits and those advantages.
And all that time, I would think that they were just doing that to induce me to sign up with them, because it just sounds like a really good deal.
No, there's a cost mentality behind that by doing that, and that's why those retail providers do that. So, if there's a way to acquire customers and do it most cost effectively, competition will find that way.
And that's, just to move this conversation forward, I think that again, in my mind, is an important, discussion point, because there will be a new ability to tailor fit the needs of the customer with the service being provided. Some people who maybe travel quite a bit and aren't home every day running their air conditioning may need a very different plan than someone like my family. It's a busy family, and there's something always running. And
a casino worker who works the day shift versus a casino worker who works graveyard. There may be completely different consumption patterns between the two ultimately, and there may be benefits to different types of services provided to them because of that.
So that's just why we're talking through. One thing in my mind that I think might be answering some of the question I'm looking for is some of those tailored service packages to really match customers with their particular needs and their particular wants in terms of their beliefs towards renewable energy and other values embrace kind of through their purchase power and what they choose to spend their money on that they're not necessarily able to do right now. Because we do have a one size, we have different time of use rates and some things like that, but it's a different structure. Mr. Volz, go ahead.
Yes, for the record, Fred Volz. A few comments. It seems as though Mr. Wellinghoff is not really representative of the average consumer who really doesn't want to spend a lot of time thinking about electricity. They want to flip the switch. They want to know it reliably is on. To posit that people are going to spend all of this time trying to figure out how to save a few kilowatt hours and maybe a few pennies on their bill relatively just doesn't seem to reflect the average Nevadan. So I really question whether that's reality or fantasy land, frankly. As far as the ROI on some of these changes, and I think of the $9,000 solar thermal water heater that we still have this program for, that really no one is interested in participating in because it's so extremely expensive compared to a conventional source. Most of these programs, unfortunately, have a horrible return on investment, or ROI as it's known in the financial world. And that includes changing out appliances, weatherizing homes and apartments, replacing windows. None of them really have a great payback. And that is a problem with all of this attempt to reduce usage. People are going to use what they need, and particularly, again, going back to the air conditioning situation. If you're in Las Vegas and it's the middle of the day and it's 110 degrees, you really don't have a whole lot of options but to use your air conditioning if you want to be at all comfortable. So that is the reality, not the fantasy of electricity usage. But going to your issues, Chair, about policy decisions and what do we do, I'm looking at costs on slide 15 from NVE's, one of their presentations to the Governor's Committee on Energy Choice. They come up with a $42 million change, total annual out-of-market obligation to provide net metering to the people who have signed up, both the AB 405 impact and the existing rooftop installations. Now, the legislature has spoken. They've decided as a policy that this state is going to move forward in various ways on renewable energy. That probably is not going to change even with another legislature. That is going to move forward, good, bad, or indifferent. That's just the way it is. So I don't think we have to worry too much about that part of the equation changing, but we do have to worry about any new providers coming in and saying to the state, well, we'll meet the renewable portfolio standard or the integrated resource plan that says we have to do X, Y, and Z by such and such a date and hit the mark. They don't have to buy, voluntarily anyway, the power that is produced by the individual NEM customer at the residential level, or even if we have a CCA or something, some other construct. What they can easily say is that either they'll go out of state to some other solar installation or wind installation and secure their part of that requirement from there, or they could put up some sort of a system within the state, probably at a much lower cost per installation than doing it on each individual rooftop. It's, again, volume and it's scale, and the costs are going to change accordingly. But the big issue that we have, again, this goes back to the cost, is that if we were to continue as a public policy to encourage widespread installation of rooftop solar, we have an issue that has nothing to do with FERC. It has to do with rebuilding the grid in the state, which historically is a unidirectional flow of power from a power station to a user. If we have lots of individual generators, the grid has to be able to handle that bidirectional flow of electricity. And if it was on a widespread basis, that the grid as we know it today probably could not handle that technically and engineering-wise.
And that's a good point. And unfortunately, we have Senate Bill 146 and our Senate Bill 204 from the legislature that were passed last session, where we have investigations looking at those issues. And not only the storage issue, but distribution systems, kind of at the home
Mhm.
home levels, to try to understand that. That opens up another question. Does that type of centralized planning that we currently do in Nevada, and that legislature provides direction to the Public Utilities Commission, and it's part of the commission's job to then enact that. How does this new world change that ability to participate in that type of centralized planning and controlled by the policymakers?
Well, if the legislature speaks in the next session, if this initiative passes, they're probably going to say all existing NEM customers, and maybe ones going forward, will be assigned to these new providers, assuming they come to the state on some basis. They're not going to just say, well, tough luck because NV Energy is no longer in the business, you're out of luck and you don't have anybody to sell to. There will likely be a legislative mandate that continues on and is not disturbed.
And again, just to follow up on where we're having the conversation, another reality though of why we're here is 72% of Nevada voters give the thumbs up for this concept as they understood it, and want to move forward with it. And as we're America, we're a democracy. We believe in our self-determination, our the belief that the electorate knows what's best, and we abide by that. Part of what we need to be looking at is, if the electorate gives a thumbs up again this November, we need to make it work, and work well.
Well, that's why I'm saying the legislature will speak, and it will assign the people who are involved with net metering with NVE right now to some new provider.
My
To drop them.
My concern is, again, if something's hidden and not intentionally hidden, but out there in this language, that will somehow prevent that from happening, or make it not happen the way folks envision. And that's why I want to talk through that. And I think that's one of the purposes for the workshop. Mr. Wellinghoff.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but I hate to take the bait, but I have to respond to the Fantasyland comment, because I've only been doing this for 40 years. And the 7 years that I spent at FERC, I think demonstrated very aptly that, consumers will respond and do respond. Yes, they don't want to micromanage their energy on a minute-by-minute basis. They don't do that. But in PJM, which is one of the largest ISOs in the country, as I say, goes from New Jersey to Chicago, there's over 10,000 megawatts of demand response that is behind the meter of consumers, and a lot of it residential, a lot of it industrial, commercial, but nevertheless, consumers responding, and no, they don't respond individually, they do it through aggregators. There are third-party aggregators, demand response providers, other entities who assist them and put in the controls and put in the equipment, that it's all done seamlessly. It's done in a way that ultimately reduces the need in PJM to put in 10,000 megawatts of capacity that they would need without those consumers responding and getting paid for it. They get paid, a good reasonable fee to do that. So for us to wave our arms and dismiss its fantasy land, to assume that this is going to happen in Nevada, just belies the fact that this is done all over the world and is done successfully.
Thank you. With that, and again, we're just having a conversation, it's important dialogue. And I appreciate all the views that are being expressed here today on the record. With that, I would like to open up the microphones and the chairs to anyone who wants to give or interested in giving some general comments. And then we'll go to Las Vegas to see if anyone in Las Vegas would like to do the same.
I've got a quick general comment, Mr. Chairman. John Wellinghoff again for ECI, returning to Fantasyland. There was some discussion earlier in the day about stranded costs and ranges of stranded costs, and one of the numbers that was thrown around was the number for the PPAs. So I went back and looked at the PPAs, and it turns out that one of the PPAs that's listed there is almost $1 billion worth of costs, happens to be the Hoover contract at $27 a megawatt hour for a 50-year period. And that's listed as a cost of $1 billion. Well, there's no cost to the Nevada consumers for that contract. In fact, it is a benefit, it is an asset to Nevada consumers that will be retained by them. In fact, we've had discussions with the executive and staff of the Colorado River Commission, and it's our question that those benefits, in fact, will be retained by Nevada consumers. So to list that as a cost is more than disingenuous, and I think is representative of the people who are throwing around these numbers. The numbers are ultimately going to be ones that you will decide upon, Mr. Chairman. Once this is all put in place, it'll be up to the commission to determine the divestiture of assets, what those real auction costs are and the benefits are, or the costs that may result from them, and how those will all be sorted out for consumers. So again, you know, it's something that I think is really the responsibility of the commission, and responsibility of the commission, I think, to not accept numbers that are really not based upon on solid evidence here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Volz.
Yes, hello again, Chairman Fred Volz. When somebody is trying to sell you something, they have an obligation to put a price tag on it, not expect the consumer to guess the price or take it on faith that they're getting value for what they're paying. And again, it is incumbent upon the people who have proposed this for our state to make that case to us. They didn't do it really in the first vote that you cited of 72%. What they did was to paint a picture of reduced costs, it's going to be a glorious future, just trust us. And they really have an obligation, not only to this commission, but to the state and the people who have to pay the bills, to make that case that it's actually good for us, and they haven't done that. And I would strongly ask them to step up to the plate and do their job, rather than trying to challenge what has been put forward. They have to take an affirmative step. They have not done that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Barbash and Mr. McGinley, hello.
Hi, thank you, Chairman. Thanks for the opportunity to provide comments towards the end of the day here today. I just wanted, from my perspective, I just wanted to maybe add to a few things that others have information that has been provided today. First of all, when we were talking about the RISA report and the EIA data and the graph that was in there, that's correct. Those graphs do depict decrease in electric rates, and Nevada's done very well, as has Texas, in decreasing the electric rates. And so you were reading that right, that it varies by rate class, but I think Nevada was second in residential rate reductions in that RISA report. I think you'll be happy to know that the latest EIA data that has a full year, 2016, Nevada's rates were lower than any deregulated state, including Texas. Not on a decreased basis, but in an overall electric price. So I just wanted to add that point. That's the latest information from EIA, that Nevada's prices are lower than any deregulated state. And I also just wanted to respond to a comment Mr. Volz made today on transition costs being recovered potentially over 20 to 30 years. That's probably a pretty long time to call something a transition. I think most other states that deregulated tried to recover their stranded and transition costs. I think the idea was mostly thought 5 to 6 years. Few were probably able to do that because the costs are very large, and maybe had to extend that to maybe 9 or 10 years. But I think 20 or 30 years is a long transition period to recover a cost of an initiative. The estimates provided in NV Energy's comments for restructuring, I just want to clarify that those were not intended to be all-inclusive, and they're very high-level preliminary estimates. we don't have a plan yet or on what the constitutional amendment really means. So it's difficult to come up with very detailed costs. So they were very high level. They do not include all the costs of restructuring. They don't include the ongoing costs of a wholesale market, potentially, that Nevada would pay to California for if it went that direction for joining an ISO, or to the Southwest Power Pool if it went that direction. They don't include ongoing costs of operating a data manager or a switching website. They don't include the transfer of the public policy programs that we were just talking about. And we didn't try, not experts on state regulatory agencies and functions and programs, but they didn't include any of the additional costs that would be required to operate a new market. And lastly, they also did not include the impact to Sierra Pacific's gas customers of the electric company not needing the supply contracts that currently, the gas supply transportation contracts that it currently shares with Sierra Pacific's gas company. So that will probably be another cost if we would like to hold the gas customers harmless that weren't intended to be brought into this constitutional amendment impacts. That could potentially be another transition cost.
And if I can, just because we haven't heard a whole lot about that, I mean, or what you are saying is that the Northern Nevada gas customers that are serviced by Sierra Pacific currently could see a rise in their rates, depending on how this is implemented.
And we indicated in our comments that Sierra Pacific gas customers could see a $20 to $25 million increase in firm gas transportation contracts. Right now they share that with the electric company, and the gas customers peak in the winter, the electric customers peak in the summer. So those firm gas transportation contracts to fuel the power plants and to serve the local distribution gas customers are shared. And the local distribution gas company would still need those contracts and pay the whole entire cost.
So where they're shared by the joint electric and gas customers, Sierra Pacific Power would no longer be servicing that with respect to the electric customers, so those entire costs will go to the gas bill.
Correct. A large portion of them.
Okay.
As well as probably some additional billing costs if the electric company's not sending a bundled bill anymore. There's some other synergies and just other corporate functions that the two companies share that the gas company will pick up a larger portion of.
Okay. No, thank you for that. You can go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you, or if you're done.
Good afternoon, Chairman Jack McGinley, and the Energy for the record. I just wanted to comment briefly on your question on the net metering, if I may. You asked about how 405 is going to work in the new world, if I can paraphrase. And I guess I share a concern, if your concern is the uncertainty now related to net metering customers. I agree with you that we've gone through a lot in the last couple of years. We've finally got to a stable place with net metering in Nevada, which is a good thing. And what I see with the initiative, though, the impacts of that is AB 405 is premised on excess energy being priced at a retail rate. And in the future, that retail rate doesn't exist from NV Energy. It's going to be a market-based rate. And the retail rate today is set by you, the commission. So the commission has control over what that net metering excess energy is going to be. In the future, what I heard on Tuesday here was that the market will set the rate. And so I could envision a situation where you have multiple retail marketers in town, and they would be offering different services to the consumers. And if they're setting the rate, you're going to have customers with different values for net metering now, because they're going to have different market rates. So I think where right now there's certainty, they know what they're going to get, and in fact in the general rate case, the solar industry was asking for and got a projection of that, right? So we're projecting out now 95, 88, 81, 75, and that's something the solar industry wanted. You can't do that today because you don't know what the price is now going to be for the excess energy. I don't know what the solution is. I don't know. I just I believe that uncertainty unfortunately creates a new issue that we have to deal with. Doesn't mean we can't deal with it. That, and then there's another element. There's a couple more elements of 405 that I've been thinking about. One is batteries. You know, contained in 405 is the requirement of NV Energy to, I think the words are promote and develop the use of batteries and something similar to that. And then we're required to file time variant rates to encourage the use of the development of batteries. In the future, since that's embedded in 405 in the state law, you know, does that same requirement now apply to retail marketers? Do they have to come up with time of use rates? You know, and if so, who sets them and who approves those? And if they don't, that's okay. We're just going to have to go back in and amend 405 to take that provision out. So, again, I don't have any solutions, but thinking about it and how the structure of 405 was, I think some of that needs to be rethought as a result of the initiative. Those are my thoughts related to that.
No, thank you. And any solutions you can think of, I'd be interested in hearing.
Thank you, sir.
So thank you. Anyone else from Carson City that would like to make a comment this time? Going to Las Vegas, is there any members of the public in Las Vegas that would like to comment on today's issue in the workshop? Hearing and seeing none, we're going to recess and end in today's workshop on costs today. And I anticipate a very robust discussion on this next Friday when we revisit it. I'd ask anyone who's listened over the website or followed this or here in person for any of the questions that have been raised in additional information that can be provided. I think it's helpful. The more that doubt and uncertainty is identified and eliminated to the extent possible, I think it's better for all parties. I mean, wherever anybody stands on this, and really want to keep the focus that the intent is to look for answers, to look to solutions, and how we make this work and make it the best it can be. And so I want to appreciate everyone's comments and participation in today's hearing. I think it's very valuable, and it's doing a public service by just having this conversation out here on the record. It's a candid conversation and a tough conversation with some of the subjects, but I think it's extraordinarily important, and that's what our democracy is about. And so with that, there will be no workshop on Monday, and the workshop will resume on this coming Tuesday. And if you give me a moment. It'll be Tuesday, January 23rd. We'll take up again any follow-up discussion on the legal issues, on some of the goals, interpretation, language within the ballot measure itself. And I can say this from my viewpoint, I've found these workshops very helpful to me in my understanding of some of these terms, because I can look at language, alone in my office and think in my own mind what something means, but then when I hear other perspectives on it, it broadens my understanding. And so we'll take that up again on January 23rd at 10 a.m. And so thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend. Thank you.